Thank you for joining us here at the Bylund Clinic Podcast. My name is Dr. James Bylund. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and educational psychologist and the owner of the Bylund Clinic.
Hi, my name is Danielle Morales. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and the co-director of the clinic.
And so today we're going to be talking about a topic we haven't discussed in any other previous podcasts, but really the distinction between a mild intellectual disability and a specific learning disability. We found over the years that this distinction between the two can cause a lot of confusion amongst IEP teams and certainly also amongst parents. And so we're going to talk about what an intellectual disability is, what a specific learning disability is, how that distinction between the two is made. Talk about what that looks like under special education law and really why it matters to kids and families, because it's not just about the label on the paper, but also about the services and supports kids receive, not just in school, but beyond school into adulthood, and why this distinction really does matter for those individuals. So probably a good place to start. Danielle, if you agree, is just talking about what IQ is. So much of these decisions and the distinction between an intellectual disability and a specific learning disability really does impinge not entirely, but in large part on a child's measured kind of quote unquote IQ, right? So probably a good place to start. A lot of times people think of like IQ as being synonymous with intelligence, and the two certainly do go hand in hand in a lot of ways. But intelligence is a pretty like abstract concept, right? And really there's no agreement amongst the psychologists of the world what exactly intelligence is, right? But IQ is something that we can measure, right? And IQ stands for intelligence quotient, and really what it is somebody's performance on a battery of tests in areas that we have broad agreement are related to intelligence, and comparing their performance to others their age, right? And these battery of tests can include a wide range of different skills that we look at, and then sort of for a simple way of thinking it is like what's their average performance across all of these scores results in a kind of quote unquote IQ score, right? So I think a good place to start is really like what are these skills that we're assessing on IQ tests, and sort of universally across the board, what we look at are things like verbal ability and what they call like nonverbal fluid reasoning. So verbal ability, put pretty simply, right, is our vocabulary, our fund of words and understanding of what words mean, and verbal reasoning skills, so our ability to sort of understand the relationships between different words or verbal concepts. And the other fluid reasoning is really just our ability to see patterns in information, right? Can we see patterns in information in order to predict what an outcome might be? Can we see patterns in information in order to be able to solve problems we've never seen before? So these are really sort of the core skills associated with IQ. And again, we administer tests of vocabulary and verbal reasoning. We administer tests of kids' ability to see patterns in information and solve problems they've never seen before, and then look at their performance, relative to others their age. And when we do that, it produces an IQ score, right? And people go to school for years to sort of understand the statistics behind all this stuff. But basically, an average score, we're looking at a score of 100. Right. And there's sort of an average range, right? This average range, which there's debate in terms of what exactly that average range is. But the average range basically goes from the 25th to 75th percentile, which is like a 90 to 110. So, basically 10 points on either side of that 100 mark. Now, without going into too much detail here, when we talk about an intellectual disability, we're talking about scores at or below the 70th, a score of 70, a standard score of 70, which falls around the second percentile, right? So if you think about this average range being 25th to 50th percentile, when we're talking about an intellectual disability, there's some wiggle room, right? But we're really talking about scores down around that second percentile or below. Anything you add to that, Danielle?
No, I think when we get into the weeds of some of the testing nuances, we'll speak a little more about, supporting skills and tertiary and secondary skills that are assessed as part of these batteries. But I think that's a good summary of kind of the core conceptual reasoning and a good grounding in what we're looking for in terms of, generally average functioning.
Okay, awesome. Again, we're going to talk about intellectual disabilities. We're going to talk about specific learning disabilities, similarities and differences, etc. But maybe just to get us started here, Danielle, can you tell us what an intellectual disability is?
Yes, I think before we do that, we should talk quickly about adaptive skills, just so we have that
Oh,
term ironed out. Can you define adaptive skills?
yeah, that's a good point. It will, I'm sure, get into all this stuff in a little bit more detail as we go through the presentation. But when we're looking at an intellectual disability, it's not based purely on test scores. There was a lot of court cases, in fact, in the 1970s that said schools can't just look at IQ scores, right? Because there's a lot of different factors that might influence somebody's performance on a quote unquote IQ test, right? So they said, hey, you really have to look at adaptive skills too. Now, this is not just true in schools, this is true in clinical settings as well too, right? But adaptive skills are basically like our daily living skills, right? So if we have an intellectual disability, for example, it's not just going to impact our performance in school, right? It's going to impact us across a wide range of different areas. So it could impact, well, certainly our functional academics, right? So like our functional reading skills, our ability to tell time, use money, things like that. But also affect things like our daily living skills. So our ability to independently care for ourselves, right? It can also affect our social skills, right? Doesn't mean we're not like socially outgoing and engaging, but oftentimes engaging at more of a concrete level, right? So these adaptive skills are things like our functional academic skills, our language and communication skills, our social skills, and our adaptive daily living skills. So again, our ability to care for our own needs, from preparing meals to hygiene to navigating the community, and so forth. Anyway, like cover it there.
I think so. Yeah. Thanks for breaking that down before we get into definitions of these
Yeah.
things. It's good to have clarity on what some of the terms mean.
Yeah, for sure. So given all that, then maybe you can just tell us what an intellectual disability is.
Yeah, so an intellectual disability has a lot of similarities both clinically in the DSM-5 and under the Educational Code for Special Education IDEA. So there's three big factors that are relevant for intellectual disability or ID. So we're looking for significantly below average intellectual functioning. As James had said, that's generally intellectual skills that are falling at the second percentile or lower, so a standard score of 70, concurrent with deficits in adaptive functioning. And as James had said, those are things like daily living skills, communication, or self care. And then evidence that these difficulties were present before age 18. So in schools, this means that a child could qualify for special ed services under ID if these difficulties are affecting their educational performance and they require specialized instruction. However, there's a little more nuance to the identification of ID clinically and educationally that we'll be unpacking today. So right out of the gate, one of the big differences is that the DSM has severity indicators for ID. So there is a mild, a moderate, or a severe classification of ID that is used clinically. There is not this specificity in IDEA. And so, because there's this one big umbrella or catch all of just intellectual disability, we often see that lack of specificity leads to misunderstandings in IEP teams, particularly when we're fleshing out the difference between a mild intellectual disability and a severe specific learning disability. So, that's one of the things that we're going to unpack. And we also find often that, understandably so, IEP team, the parents and the districts are very judicious about applying the ID label. And again, I think part of the tricky part of this conversation is because there's not those specifiers of mild, moderate, or severe. And so when it is a more mild presentation of an intellectual disability, sometimes there can be a tendency to avoid the true diagnosis or the true classification of kids. So again, right, it's always a balance when we're affixing a label. But one of the things we want to talk through today is really being carefully considering the data to make sure that the label or diagnosis is accurately applied because of the real world consequences of avoiding ID just because of the stigma.
Yeah, that's an important point, and I know we're going to talk about it more as we go through all of this. And I think, understandably, right, like this point about schools and parents just being very cautious about assigning that ID label, because I think for parents a rightful fear about what that means for the future, sort of put sort of in our minds sort of like a cap on their potential, right? Or their ability to overcome some of these challenges that they're experiencing. And as a parent, what does that mean for my child, not just through school, but as an adult? What does that mean for my child when I'm no longer here to take care of them? So it's certainly a really heavy label, but as you sort of pointed towards, and I know we're going to talk about later, it does have some really important implications in terms of the types of skills and how we're providing instruction, the type of skills we're teaching a young person, the types of services that they're going to get as an adult, right? And the support services available to them as an adult, with a mild intellectual disability that wouldn't be, available to them as having a specific learning disability. So, yeah, so thanks for that. And probably then, as we're sort of kind of going through and defining all of these terms here, talking about what an intellectual disability is, maybe share with our audience what a specific learning disability is, and then maybe we can kind of talk about the differences between those and what we're looking at in terms of our testing data.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what is a specific learning disability? So under IDEA, we call this category SLD. So a specific learning disability or disorder is different than an intellectual disability. So children with SLD have average or even above average intelligence, but they struggle in one or more academic area, like reading, writing, or math. So, learning disabilities are often associated with some of the more commonly known diagnoses like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, right? So these students who have SLD often show what we call a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, or a discrepancy between cognitive abilities and academic skills. So that means they might be great at something like verbal reasoning or that nonverbal problem solving, but then they struggle significantly with things like decoding words or organizing the written work. And so that disconnect between like overall what we call like cognitive potential or intellectual potential and their academic performance is typically considered to be the hallmark of a learning disability.
So having that generally average range conceptual skills, what we talked about earlier, like the verbal reasoning, nonverbal processing, sort of core conceptual abilities, and the sort of unexpected difference between those core conceptual abilities and their achievement in reading, writing, or math.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what sort of came up for me as you were talking about that too, I think like this word specific, right? This sort of specific learning disability. And now we see a lot of kids that have multiple learning disabilities, right? I mean, lots of kids who have dyslexia or impaired reading ability also have difficulties with writing, or they may also have difficulties with math, right? But again, it's specific to those areas of academic achievement versus maybe some areas of adaptive skills, which we'll talk about, or those core conceptual abilities are reasonably preserved. So it's pretty specific, right? It's specific to academic achievement. It's not this sort of broad, more general learning disability that's affecting them across all areas of life, including their daily living skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so more specific versus general. So now this is where things get super confusing, right? For everybody other than the person administering the tests, right? We administer this battery of tests. Nobody in the world knows what the heck it is we're actually testing. Nobody really knows how to interpret the numbers outside of the professionals who administer these tests. So here, without getting too deep into the weeds here, maybe we talk about what the like test interpretation and what some of those scores look like.
Yes. So yes, here's where it kind of blows up, right? Here's where the rubber meets the road and it gets really confusing. So what we all covered up till this point sounds like it should be relatively concrete, right? So we're looking at, these scores that are on the lower end of the normative curve, like around a second percentile with ID, concurrent with deficits and adaptive functioning for ID. Okay, that sounds pretty clear, right? Versus a kid who has an IQ, again, more at the 50th percentile or 75th percentile, who's struggling just with reading, right? And a lot of times we do see clear delineation of profiles, right? And those typically aren't the cases where there's a lot of debate within the IEP team around what the correct classification is. However, of course, in the real world, things get really obscured. So, these cutoff scores can be presented as clear delineations by the IEP teams, where in fact, as we kind of alluded to earlier in the conversation, even among professional circles, there's not alignment among, what is an average score? What is a low average score? What is a below average score? So I think grounding this conversation of where some of the confusion and miscommunication and misdiagnosis comes up, I think that's a really important place to start. Is if you were in, one school district, they may be calling a score of an 81 almost average, low average. And if you go see, a neuropsychologist, they will call that borderline intellectual functioning, right? So those are two very different kind of conceptualizations of the exact same score. And so again, even among the professional community, that can make it really difficult, especially in a setting like an IEP meeting where emotions can already be running high. There may be some contention between like an outside assessor and the school psychologist. And that, well, our district model says an 85 is average, right? And so, not to get too in the weeds and numbers, but I think it's important to like very clearly lay out on the table that those psychometrics are interpreted differently by different professionals. So I think that's the starting place of where some of this miscommunication and misdiagnosis arises from. One of the things that we often see in our work as independent assessors is a particular pattern with potential mild ID. So, for example, we'll see a student with cognitive scores that for years have generally fell in the 70s, right? So again, around like the second, third, fourth percentile. So very low on the normative curve, we're seeing intellectual and, conceptual reasoning. And they're labeled year after year as having a specific learning disability, right? So we're seeing kind of as what we would say clinically, like this borderline intellectual profile, or, right at the cusp of mild ID. And you're seeing a specific learning disability label. When this becomes a big flag for us is when, within those low scores, core conceptual reasoning skills are impacted. So as we talked about earlier, right, when kids are showing those low scores and particularly low scores and, the 70s or upper 60s and things like nonverbal reasoning and, crystallized knowledge, which is, that verbal reasoning piece, that's a big flag. We often see that what can happen, particularly within school districts, is difficulties can be glazed over when other like more rote or shallow skills are higher. So what we mean by that is, again, we'll see, lower scores in core conceptual reasoning, abstract reasoning, things like executive functioning that really demand more intellectual prowess. And then we'll see scores even in the average range on things that require repetition or memorizing. So something like short-term memory span, right? Being able to immediately repeat back information that was heard, or phonological processing. And these just are equated as being equivalent, right? And this is a misunderstanding, but it's something that we often see.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we do see that a lot. And that's why I think it's really helpful to kind of continue to ground like our understanding of what kind of IQ is, right? And again, these sort of core conceptual abilities, right? This verbal ability, verbal reasoning, nonverbal reasoning, ability to see patterns and solve problems I've never seen before. It is a fundamentally different like ability than our ability to just repeat back something I just heard, right? So there's all of these different skills that we assess, and all of them are different, kind of quote unquote cognitive skills, but they're not all equal, right? In terms of their relative importance to learning, to school performance, to adaptive skills and so forth. And you're right. I mean, this does create a little confusion because a lot of times people are thinking about a global intellectual disability as if all scores are sort of flatlined at the same level, right? Well, I don't see a lot of people in our line of work that have even skills across all areas, right? We all have relative strengths and weaknesses, right? My nonverbal problem solving is far better than my verbal abilities, right? Like, and every standardized test I've ever taken shows it the same discrepancy, But again, these are sort of core conceptual abilities, and versus these little rote skills, right? And we can have accurate sort of perception of information, right? At the lowest level, right? Like, am I hearing something accurately to sort of lower level cognitive abilities where I can sort of repeat back what I heard, right? Or recognize the similarities and distinctions between two different shapes, for example. But that's very different than my ability to comprehend complex language structure, right? Very different than my ability to see patterns in information and predict outcomes, right? These are these sort of like higher level conceptual abilities that really require me to integrate multiple pieces of information to relate my current situation to my prior knowledge in order to be able to think about how I might approach a task or solve a problem. So yeah, very different. And you're right. Sometimes schools are almost treating these as if they're equally weighted. when they're just not. Some of them are core to our core conceptual abilities, and others are sort of lower level processing abilities.
Hmm. Yeah. And in fact, I know we were chatting a little bit before recording kind of what we see clinically when we see kids for assessment with intellectual disabilities. A lot of times when I'm seeing low conceptual reasoning and higher short-term memory, that for me is actually a flag for ID, right? Because a lot of times kids have picked up kind of that immediate repetition of the last instruction or the last piece of information that they heard as a masking or compensatory strategy, that there's not a deeper conceptual understanding of maybe what's being discussed in conversation or instructionally. But they know that if the teacher calls on them and they repeat back the last thing they heard, the teacher might say, oh, okay, you're following along. And that
Yeah.
can be a really effective strategy throughout, more concrete aspects of instruction. So really during early elementary school, right? Usually you start to see the facade kind of cracking once again, the questions do just demand a higher level of abstract reasoning.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a good point too, in that these are developmental abilities, right? So these are things that continue to develop throughout childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. And and when we're doing this testing, well, any parent out there, right, like knows that when our kids are 4, 5, and 6 years old, their reasoning abilities are pretty limited, right? And so our ability to assess reasoning abilities is pretty limited, right? There's not a whole lot we're expecting of kids at that age when it comes to more sort of abstract concepts and reasoning abilities. And so, you might get a profile that's not at the second percentile, right? When they're 4, 5, and 6 years old. Maybe it's hovering around the ninth percentile. And for us, that's below average, but being at the ninth percentile. But school districts will oftentimes say all the way down to the ninth percentile is within their extremely broad average range, right? And so these
Mhm.
kids are being labeled with things other than ID, and at that point, understandably so, right? Like I wouldn't jump out the gate and be like, oh, they're ID when I've got a score of an 81. But that doesn't mean that score of 81 is always going to be an 81, right? Like that score of the ninth percentile, as kids are getting older and they're not developing at the same rate as their peers, we may see their relative standing to those other kids drop, right? And that ninth percentile, the next time around might look more like the fifth percentile, and the time after that might look a little bit more like the second percentile. And I mean, I know we talked about it just very briefly, but I heard you mention it, like diagnosing ID has to happen in the developmental period. That means all the way to 18, right? So that profile that the kid had when they're 5, 4, 5, 6, and even 7 years old, by the time that they're 9, 10, 11, 12, that those conceptual abilities relative to the others their age, could look a whole lot different.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think this is a misunderstanding sometimes of, again, not just what intelligence is, but what the tests that we're administering measure and how to interpret the data, right? And so I think there is a misunderstanding that IQ is stable, right? And that is can be true, right? For some individuals, especially if you're an adult and there's no, changes to your medical, situation or a traumatic brain injury, then like at some point we'd expect, your IQ to be relatively stable. And some, individuals do, some kids, especially with more of the learning disability profile, do show pretty like average scores early on, and that, sticks throughout their development. And, right, there's always the and, that's not always the case. I mean, the early checklists and some of those early assessment batteries will say on them, these are not predictive of later cognitive development, right? So it's kind of you're almost screening up until mid elementary school of where IQ was falling, and sometimes the chips don't settle until later, when you can really assess things like conceptual reasoning and executive functioning with more depth and breadth, both on the assessments, because there's a greater range of questions that we're able to give to students in that age that's going to more deeply probe that ability. And again, as the academic demands are necessitating abstract reasoning. So these, issues with conceptual reasoning may not be apparent until you are presenting a kid with something like algebra versus two-step computational problems or single-step computational problems. And we'll talk a little bit about the plateau and that also being a flag for ID a little later on. I think another area that is important when we're talking about misidentification is there also can still be a discrepancy between IQs that are more in that borderline or mild ID range of a 70, a 71, a 72, and academic scores that on, again, these standardized assessments that we give are in the 50s. And so, again, I know the psychometrics can be confusing, but I also think it's important for parents to know that just because there's a discrepancy doesn't mean that this conversation should stop there.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And kind of going back to this idea to like sort of the continuum of intellectual disability, right? Which IDA or special education regulations just doesn't acknowledge, right? Is this continuum of mild to severe, right? And particularly these kids sort of on the milder end of the continuum, again, may present, may see some, mild deficits in terms of adaptive skills, probably have, maybe identified as having a speech or language impairment. They were slow to acquire language. Maybe they were a little slower to, develop some of those gross motor skills, but not terribly far off, right? Versus kids sort of more moderate to severe intellectual disabilities, may never acquire language, right? And so, it again, sort of this continuum of intellectual disability and what sort of that mild profile might look like. And like you said, sort of that we could see that discrepancy, right? That discrepancy between ability and achievement. And, particularly as kids are getting, older, right? Frankly, at the very young ages, when kids are just acquiring academic skills, it's very hard to even get a discrepancy, right? Because what we're anticipating the skills we expect them to have is limited, right? They're just learning their letter names and sounds, right? Versus kids get older. But some of these kids, depending on what their profile looks like, even with mild ID, may acquire some rote academic skills reasonably well, right? Can learn some basic reading skills, can basic spelling skills, basic arithmetic, but they tend to not progress too much farther beyond that, right? So as like you said, as they're getting older, they're struggling with reading comprehension, right? Maybe they can read the words okay, but they're not comprehending what they're reading, or they might be able to spell, but they have a harder time with sentence structure, let alone like writing a paragraph or a multi-paragraph piece. And because of that, because their just general development in those areas is slower, their relative standing to others their age, they tend to fall farther and further behind, right? Because these academic skills are really exponential in their growth, right? Once we acquire basic literacy skills and we can read to learn, our reading skyrockets, right? And kids with mild ID are just not going to be able to keep that same pace of development, right? And so, what we might see, like you said, is a kid that has, sort of borderline or intellectual abilities, mild intellectual disability, with those scores sort of hovering in the low 70s, but their academic skills, again, relative to others their age, might look more like the first percentile rather than the second or fifth percentile. And that might not sound like very discrepant, right? But statistically, that could be a severe discrepancy, right? Between somebody whose intellectual abilities between the second and fifth percentile and their academic skills are below the first percentile.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, the more we're talking about this, and I don't want to conflate psychological disorders or mental health disorders too much with neurodevelopmental disorders like ID and SLD. But it's kind of funny that sometimes I find IEP teams applying like a really different standard to things like ID or SLD. And I think there's a tendency for once something like SLD is on the IEP, it's treated as, the final word, right? Like the last truth, right? Like, no, they're dyslexic. We determined they were dyslexic in second grade. And, again, it's carried over in perpetuity on the IEP without really looking at those lower cognitive scores, assessing adaptive skills. And it's interesting when you think about it, because we don't apply the same standard to psychological disorders, right? Even though they're both on the spectrum of human development, right? So, when you see people who have a later diagnosis of, a psychological disorder like bipolar disorder, that's usually not diagnosed in childhood, right? Like you'll see, diagnoses bounce around from like, oh, we think, they're autistic. We think, that's anxiety, it's depression. And then later on kind of you see, a retroactive diagnosis or things come into to greater clarity of what was actually the prodromal phase of something like bipolar disorder. And so it's interesting because, for something like you're saying with ID or SLD, the labels shift, right? It can be speech and language impairment, it can be speech and language disability, and then later, as we can more deeply assess conceptual reasoning, it can actually be ID. And so, I think that there's like a sticking point and kind of a cognitive inflexibility around things like neurodevelopmental disabilities, as opposed to psychological disorders. And again, not to overly conflate that, but I think, again, it's still just on the spectrum of child development and human development, and why we have to assess kids frequently.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, and just what we anticipate at different ages of development is different, right? So the kid with a mild ID probably could get a diagnosis of a speech and language disorder when they're younger, because we're what we're expecting of them is to acquire language, right? Early in their elementary grades, and we're expecting them to be able to learn their letters and letter sounds and how to add and subtract numbers. If they're having difficulty with that relative to others their age, maybe that's starting to look like a learning disability. And as they get older, if again, like you've mentioned multiple times, right, if they're not developing those sort of abstract reasoning and conceptual skills, that may start to look more like an intellectual disability, particularly if it's paired with those deficits in adaptive skills. And maybe that's just a good place to jump into now too, right? Because we're not just talking about low IQ scores, right? That's a test performance, right? But we're also looking at how that's impacting them in their daily living skills, not just in school, but across their life. So maybe let's just dive into that now and just talk a little bit more in terms of what adaptive skills are.
Yeah. So I think before adaptive skills, I think one other point in kind of this scattered testing data is also Larry P. And Larry P is a whole other series of podcast episodes, and there's extensive information available. And, I don't want to open that can of worms too deeply.
We should do a podcast episode on that, though. Yeah. We should have a podcast episode on Larry P.
Yes, and there's been several updated guidance from California Ed Code. So for those that aren't familiar with Larry P, there's specific testing restrictions in the state of California around what test or what test can be administered to Black students, essentially. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about banned tests versus not banned tests. We're not going to get into that. But essentially what the interpretation is from a lot of districts is that they cannot administer IQ tests to Black students because of previously discriminatory practices that were being done in districts in the 70s and 80s and prior. And so, again, that's a whole history that has a lot of layers to unpack it over time. For this conversation today, what's relevant is that what that means is that our Black students are not having access to the same tests as white students. And that can lead to all sorts of subpar assessments. So the fact that we're not testing conceptual reasoning for our Black students means that we're never really looking often at intellectual disability, or even if it is being looked at, again, it's being looked at through all of these kinds of random rote skills that are often put together, and then it's still not addressed often. So I'll see, we measured processing speed, we measured long-term memory, we measured, short-term memory. And again, it's the elephant in the room is nobody looked at these core conceptual reasonings of crystallized knowledge or fluid reasoning, because a lot of the tests that kind of fall under that more restrictive umbrella or districts don't want to give, those are the ones that have those assessments on them. And so, again, we're then avoiding kind of the conversation in particular for this population of students, which, Larry P was intended to prevent discriminatory testing practices. And this is, and not just for ID, but for all areas, an area where our African-American students are not getting equitable assessments is in the area of conceptual reasoning.
Really, in my mind, I don't want to sort of find a word that's not going to overstate this, right? But very unfortunate unintended consequence of what was intended to be, a ruling to for moving in the direction of social justice, and in many ways it did. But over the last 40 years, we've really seen some sort of unintended consequences of it. And our testing has improved, our understanding of testing has improved. At that time, they were over-identifying Black children and saying that they were intellectually disabled when they were not. But they weren't even looking at adaptive skills, which I know we're going to talk about later. They're just looking at performance on a pretty archaic test, right? And so certainly our understanding has changed quite a bit. But just to kind of put it in context for folks too, I mean, when I first started doing this type of testing down in San Diego for a very large urban district in San Diego, kind of, probably doesn't hurt to call them out, right? But they were as probably had the strictest interpretation of Larry P of any district I've ever seen, right? And so we talked about, what core conceptual abilities are, like our vocabulary, our verbal reasoning skills, our ability to see patterns and information. We were really pretty restricted to giving some rote memory tests, some measures of like auditory processing, which, are these two words the same or different? So they can hear the similarities and differences between words. Again, some more sort of short-term rote memory tests, and some measures of motor coordination and visual perception, like looking at two forms and be able to recognize whether or not they're the same or different from one another. I mean, very low level, rote, basic cognitive processes, without requiring any higher level, conceptual skills.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, right, you're sort of piecing these things together and making your best estimate, around, where they're, in the case of ID, where their cognitive abilities fall without even looking at those core conceptual skills, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, in the worst case scenario, I mean, and this goes both ways. I mean, this isn't to say like, we're failing to identify kids as ID. I mean, the reverse could be true, right? Like what if I gave these tests to a kid who had impaired memory, right? And fully intact verbal ability and nonverbal reasoning skills. Their cognitive profile, because I just gave them, some low-level processing tests that happened to hit on their areas of processing weakness, could look really low.
Mm-hmm.
When
Mm-hmm.
in fact they're not, and they've got average or above average range intellectual abilities, and we fail to identify it. So it can really go both ways, but certainly it exemplifies, looking at these low level processing skills in piecemeal and making determinations around where somebody's conceptual skills are without having sufficient information for sure.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. And again, I think that that's a whole separate discussion, but I think it's important when we're talking again about the ambiguity of applying some of these clinical cutoffs or educational cutoffs in the real world setting, when we move into the nuances of what things actually look like on the ground. And Larry P is a big part of fragmented testing practices and not looking at profiles holistically for
Yeah.
sure.
Looking at little individual skills that are sort of low on the lower end of the totem pole
Mm-hmm,
in terms of processing abilities, and yeah, for
mm-hmm,
sure. But
mm-hmm,
again, sort of then pivot from Larry P, right? Because one of the things that they failed to do, this is a case that came out of San Francisco Unified, right? But they weren't looking at adaptive skills, right? And so one of the Judge Peckham in that case, talked about like a 6-hour disability, right? So these kids were supposedly intellectually disabled at school, and then they left school and led very normal lives in terms of their adaptive functioning.
mm-hmm.
And so, a really important thing that we look at with, intellectual disability and making this distinction is adaptive skills, right? Those daily living skills. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about those.
Yeah, for sure. So ADLs or the adaptive daily living skills are often a big hole in district assessments in particular. So a lot of times, again, we're going back to talking about these more ambiguous profiles, right? So we're seeing kids with more of the scores in the low 70s or mid 70s, kind of this borderline intellectual profile, very low academics, again, right? Like, again, at the other end of the normative curve, maybe at that below the first percentile. And then if adaptive, daily living skills are looked at all, they may be on a really broad screener, like something called the BASC, right? And it's just like, oh, they're at risk. And it really doesn't tell you any information, right? Because, again, when we have these profiles that could fall on the SLD side, the learning disability side of a more severe presentation, or, are falling more on the mild intellectual side, the really fleshing out adaptive daily living skills is important. So I think that's first, right? Is that it shouldn't be assessed in a way that is really high level and at a screener level, because kids with a learning disability can easily also show at-risk adaptive daily living skills,
Yeah.
because their learning disability may impact things like, language acquisition or communication, right? And so you really need to dig deeper with a specific assessment of adaptive daily living skills to see like, what does this look like in the real world? So I think like having actual assessment data in ADLs is a big area of need. And I think that, again, districts often pivot to not including it. It's usually not included in standard batteries unless, again, we're looking for like more of a moderate or severe ID presentation, then it's typically included. Sometimes it's included for autism evaluations, but I also find not always. And, autism and ID has a high co-occurrence rate. So anyways, these ADLs, these adaptive skills are often just, we don't have the data to really have an informed discussion around this key piece for differential diagnosis or differential educational classification. So I think that's first. Another thing that I often see is, for a diagnosis or a classification of ID, we need an impairment in one adaptive area. Sometimes, again, I often see districts requiring or kind of informally implying that we should see it across multiple areas, or we need to see like really low scores in all of these domains at home and school. And, sometimes that's the case, right? Again, if you do have this super borderline case, but other times, right, the presentation of mild ID can be a little more subtle. In particular, some of the areas that are often glazed over and not looked at super clearly are functional academics, right? So functional academics is an area of adaptive functioning. Now, we want to be really careful, right, that we're not calling somebody who has severe dyslexia that, their functional academics and reading is highly impaired. And so therefore you have an intellectual disability. Again, that's a misclassification, misdiagnosis. However, right, when we're seeing those borderline or clearly kind of in the below average range, core intellectual conceptual reasoning skills, coupled with persistently low academic skills, right, that are not progressing past kindergarten, first grade level, that's a really big flag for ID. And so when you see year after year, right, a kid has been in special education and those scores are not budging, that's a sign that the functional academic deficit may actually be more related to adaptive daily living skills. So I think that's one of the areas that I often find is conflated, where it's like, well, they struggle with, academics, so of course these scores are going to be low, but we really, again, want to see what are the functional applications. Can they, tell the time, can they do basic single step computational problems? And a lot of kids who have ID, they'll struggle with more of, again, those really foundational functional skills, and they do plateau. Another area that is often glazed over, I find, is social skills. So, kids with ID, most of the time, right, they're perfectly social and friendly kids. And so, often they're rated as being average on teacher rating scales in particular, because they're socially interested, right? They're going to initiate conversation. They're going to make eye contact, for example. And so when you have a classroom of 35 kids, you're like, oh, they're perfectly friendly. Like, they have friends they run around with in a little pack on the schoolyard. Like, it seems like there's not concerns in this area. But when we look at these skills clinically, especially when I'm meeting with a kid one-on-one in the office, you often see they're lacking when you look under the hood. So, kids with mild ID might be more relatively concrete in their conversations or social approach, and they often can miscommunicate information or even come off sometimes as being dishonest because they are misunderstanding. So they can come across as misreporting. Sometimes the information they're communicating may not make a lot of sense. And so, again, it can be communicated with this, really positive intent, but, the kind of ability to accurately remember things that have happened or accurately report things that have happened, or just kind of have a give and take prolonged, conversational exchange about something that is not relatively concrete happening in the moment, is more limited. And so I think that's an area where we have to be really careful that we're not just calling like a kid that, has friends, oh, they're average socially.
Yeah, no, so that's a really good point. And just to sort of, again, kind of recap some of this for some of our listeners who may not be as familiar with this, these tests that we give of adaptive skills are going to look at things like, bucket one, communication and functional academic skills, right? Bucket two, social skills. Bucket three, sort of adaptive daily living skills, right? And a lot of times the district's saying, oh, we have to see deficits in all these areas. Well, we may have a kid who's, adaptive daily living skills and functional academics. They may really struggle with that, but they're very social, right? And so you get this higher score in the social domain. And then the assumption though is because if it's ID, well, you have to be flatline across the board everywhere. Everything's got to be a 70 or below. But that's not always the case, right? They might have good social skills. They might have good rote memory skills, and those skills are higher. But again, we look at core conceptual abilities. We look across all areas of adaptive functioning. We are seeing this pattern of weaknesses, and I think in some ways too. I mean, even some of those adaptive daily living skills, they may be higher for somebody who's got good rote learning, and if they've had a lot of repetition and a lot of supervision and instruction at home about how to manage certain daily living skills in order to be able to help keep the house clean and to run through morning routines. Some of those skills might be higher, right? But how much direct instruction and supervision is required in order for them to be able to do those things, versus a kid who may acquire those skills and be able to execute them more independently. So it's a good point, right? We need to see these deficits in adaptive skills. That doesn't mean we see universally flatline deficits across all areas of adaptive functioning.
Totally. And I think that expecting kids to be flatlined across other areas, I know that all areas, I know there's a lot of concern about stigma for ID, but it's very reductive, right, to say that about somebody with an intellectual disability of like, oh, you don't have an intellectual disability because you have friends or because you're able to make yourself a sandwich, right? Like that's not what intellectual disability is. And so I think, keeping a broader mind of these like bigger presentations and these individual, manifestations of how neurodevelopmental disabilities show up is really important.
Yeah, for sure. Now, in this, we've covered a number of different things in terms of, why the classification may be difficult or confusing to not just parents, but, other members of the IEP team. Maybe again, we sort of mentioned the stigma, right? We might be sort of hesitant to label somebody as ID because we're concerned about the cap that we're placing on their potential, right? We talked about, the potential scattering of skills, right? How that may look, challenging if we're expecting to see sort of this flat line in skills across the board. Some of the similarities and differences between ID and SLD, and that we can have a mild ID and a discrepancy, right? So all of these things can certainly lead to the misclassification. I'm wondering now if we can kind of pivot a little bit and talk about why accurate identification matters and what the long-term implications are for getting it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that again, this is another this is another podcast episode too, which is kind of the line you hear repeated a lot at IEPs, which is eligibility does not drive services or eligibility does not drive goals. And I think yes, and right.
Yeah.
Yes, those things are not linked in this, immediately linear or concrete way. And we want to give kids accurate labels. We want to give kids accurate diagnoses. Just like when you're going to the doctor, you don't want to, oh, close enough. We'll say it's norovirus when it's not, right? Like you want to know like what is the correct label, the correct diagnosis that goes with your child's learning profile. And so I think that's one of a thing that's just important, right? Is we want to get it right because it matters, right? It matters that parents have an accurate understanding of kind of what their kids' learning profile is and what their needs are. And that can drive indeed where goals and services go. Some of the big things, right? If we're misdiagnosing ID versus SLD, we might be pushing kids towards something like a diploma path that is actually not the most appropriate for their learning profile, where they may benefit more from a program that is, allows them to stay in school for longer and work on adaptive daily living skills for an extended period of time, for example. Also, when kids graduate, there's services within the community, such as regional center support, Social Security income that do link to diagnosis. So there are, implications in terms of service access and financial access that follow kids into the community setting as well.
Yeah, for sure. And conversation that makes me think about a young man that you and I both know, right? Transitioning to high school, right? Misidentified as having a specific learning disability from a young age. Other things going on. We don't need to get into the details of this young person's entire profile, right? But one of the suggestions was this specific learning disability, and you're right. I mean, they'll say all the time, well, label doesn't drive goals and services, needs drive goals and services, right? But what ended up happening for this young person, right, is they're in eighth grade, in a special education classroom that's really just a mildly modified version of the general education classroom, right? Where they're sitting there, learning the eighth grade social studies curriculum, learning the eighth grade science curriculum, the eighth grade English language arts curriculum, and really not benefiting in any meaningful way from it, right? Because they're unable to grasp it or engage in it in a meaningful way. And then what are they potentially missing out on, right? Is, well, now they're 4 years away from potentially just being sort of matriculating through the grades and giving passing grades in these special education classes, and then getting to 18 years old and graduating from high school, and then that's it, right? They haven't developed the adaptive daily living skills to function more independently, right? Which they could have been learning perhaps if they were identified as having ID. Now that person is now identified as having ID and is going into high school to be able to get the curriculum that they can access and actually benefit from, right? But like you said too, that IP can now continue on beyond their senior year, right? So you mentioned their IP lasting longer. I mean, parents might not know this, right? Is that your IP ends when you graduate from high school, right? Or if you are on a certificate track, you can continue on to a transition program that continues to provide IEP services until you're 22. Right? 4 more additional years of IEP services to help you develop independent living skills, to develop employment skills, to learn how to manage finances and make purchases at the store and hold down a job so you can function more independently, right? And you can start working on those skills in high school all the way until you're 22 years old. And then even beyond that, like you said, now it opens up the window to Social Security benefits. It opens the door to services through the regional center. And kind of going back to the early stages, I mentioned earlier, like a parent might be very concerned about an ID label when their child is young, and what is the implications then for the rest of their life. And again, we don't need it. We can, maybe it is speech and language impairment. Then maybe it is SLD. Maybe we don't really truly feel firm in that designation of intellectual disability until they're older, right? I'm not saying we need to rush out and call kids ID. Let's give them a chance to develop and see how that progresses, right? But that label does mean they will be afforded more supports and services as adults when we as parents are less equipped to care for them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of implications for school, but a lot of implications for that child's entire life and into and through adulthood.
Yeah. Another thing that comes up, I'm thinking of another young man, a different one that I worked with, is, when teens avoid the mild ID label and are going with, no, this is a specific learning disability, or, sometimes something out of complete left field, like it's probably ADHD, but that's aside. When you're avoiding mild ID, another thing that I see is misconflating a lack of ability with lack of motivation or a behavioral problem. And so, with this other case that I'm thinking of, where the school is very resistant to ID, despite kind of, again, this historical trend of cognitive data, flatlined academics at, below the first percentile for, somebody who's now in high school. When the low adaptive skills were presented, the district framed it as behavior. They're like, well, he's just not engaging in his education. Right. So this shouldn't be that low. Basically, it was, even though it was their data, right? It was rating scales from their teacher. This shouldn't be that low. This is because he's checked out. Right. And he had a label around him as kind of being the truant kid, the behavioral problem kid. Well, he's always on his phone in class. He's always laughing. He's, saying really inappropriate things. And I'm, trying to provide psychoeducation to the team around, yes. And right. This is part of this kid's profile because, right, we've had evidence since early elementary, in his case, right, that these core conceptual reasoning skills are not present or very limited for this child in particular. And then you're sticking him in a high school classroom that he is completely unable to access, right? And he's trying to get out the door. He's trying to go avoid this because he doesn't have the the intellectual capacity nor the academics as clearly exemplified in my testing and their testing over the years, right? And so it was again, a mislabeling of this, kid kind of as a juvenile delinquent, where it's like he is lacking the skills. So if we are continuing to kind of push this narrative that, he does bad in testing because he's not trying, he's doing bad in school because he has a behavioral disorder, you're missing the forest for the tree, or for the trees for these kids.
Yeah, for sure. And listening to you share that too, made me think also, it's something I don't think we've mentioned. Certainly has to do with like adaptive skills, right? But individuals with mild intellectual disabilities are very easily taken advantage of, and very easily manipulated and put into very compromising situations, right? So the person that you described, around the wrong peer group, could be manipulated to engage in a lot of really troublesome behaviors that are, going to get them a lot, identified as having a behavior disorder, suspended or expelled from school, arrested or even imprisoned, because we're assuming that they have capacities that they lack.
Yeah.
It's a very vulnerable group of folks, when you're placed in the wrong sort of, social milieu.
Yeah, no, I like that grounding, because I think, again, sometimes there's an oversimplification of like, we'll just avoid this label because there's a lot of stigma in being called intellectually disabled. And there is, right? And again, it has to be a really balanced conversation, especially in kind of edge cases. And avoiding a label does not inadvertently mean that you've eliminated the risk. There's a whole other side of like not labeling something and missing it, right? That opens up these other consequences and other opportunities for stigma and just missed opportunities.
Yeah, and while individuals with mild intellectual disabilities will certainly require some level of support and assistance, individuals with mild intellectual disabilities can develop a lot of skills, can function relatively independently, can hold down, meaningful jobs. I think we sort of, again, talking about that sort of continuum of intellectual disability going from really mild to really profound, right? On the milder end of the continuum, you can still acquire skills and live a meaningful life. This isn't like we're not sort of sentencing these people with this label. There's still a lot that they can do, but also have resources available to them educationally and in the community as an adult to help them live the most meaningful life possible. So gosh, is there anything we didn't cover here on this topic? I feel like we covered a lot of ground. I feel like when I sit down, I'm like, oh, we're going to cover this topic in 15 or 20 minutes, and quite a bit of time passes, and I realize, wow, that was a much bigger topic than I expected.
There's a lot to say on this topic in particular, and again, I think it's there's just a lot of layers in terms of like understanding the psychometrics and the criteria, and then also kind of all the nuances and implications. I think we should just talk about what parents can do about it, right? So if you have concerns, what are the next steps that folks should take?
Yeah, well, I mean, this all really begins with a fair and accurate assessment, I guess, right? So I think going back to our assessment reports, kind of rereading them. If we need assistance in reading and interpreting those, maybe reaching out to a professional who sort of understands the testing and the implications, and perhaps getting their read and opinion on the assessment. I think as much data as we can have, right? I think is helpful, and maybe going back to the district and asking for them for the data. These maybe even the printouts of some of these reports, right? Sometimes well, something of not related to ID necessarily, right? But something that I do come across quite a bit in these assessment reports is people are choosing what data to share, right? And sometimes there's more data that is in the child's record, right? Like if you're asking for the printouts from the tests that were administered, right? So you can see all of the scores, for example, right? So maybe they're not maybe they're picking and choosing what sort of measure of general intellectual ability they're presenting, right? Or maybe they're giving some measure that, like you said, sort of barely sort of screens adaptive skills, but doesn't go into it in depth, right? And they have a section where they talk about adaptive skills, right? But again, there's sort of like more information, kind of once you look under the hood a little bit, right? So maybe asking the district for some of that data. I mean, I suppose after all of that, right, you've consulted with a professional, you've read and reread the report, interpreted the data to the best of your ability. If you still have questions or concerns, and again, this coin can flip either way, right? I mean, maybe somebody's being identified as having an intellectual disability when it's not, right?
Hmm.
Or and maybe people do have an intellectual disability, and for any one or a number of the reasons we've talked about, it just hasn't been accurately identified. You can always request a second opinion. The sort of like a statute of limitations, right? The length of time you have to request a second opinion assessment. So, if your child has an IEP, you've gotten, your walls to be plastered probably with all the copies of your procedural safeguards or parent rights that you've been given. But, in there, it talks about the right to a second opinion, right? The right to an independent educational evaluation where you can have an expert assessor, someone who's not employed by the school district, right, to come in and do their own testing and draw their own conclusions around special education eligibility and services. And obviously, that's something that we do here, at the Bylund Clinic here in the Bay Area. There's certainly plenty of other providers out there that do the same thing, but that's something that you can the right that you can exercise too is just to request a second opinion. If you disagree with the school district's evaluation.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add to that is, especially for parents of high school students, is to ask really explicit questions starting in eighth grade about transition planning.
Oh, yeah.
And so, as we had mentioned, a lot of parents aren't aware of, the post-secondary transition programs that are available. There's a lot of like work study programs and internships. And again, having that accurate diagnosis or that accurate educational label can help kids start to gain workplace experience if, higher education is not something that is, in their educational planning or educational future. So understanding, okay, they can stay in school till they're 22. What does the adult education program look like? Or, the ADL program look like? Like what goals could they be working towards? If they're in school for longer, what job placements or internships or work preparation, what that could look like. And again, every student's journey is going to be really different. While we were talking, I pulled up because I remember there's an organization specifically supporting students with intellectual disabilities in college. That's called Think College. And so there's a lot of different paths, right? Again, available. Like not one diagnosis or one classification does not determine what a kid's potential is or what their future is. It's really nuanced. It's really layered. So really understanding, what is a diploma track? What is a certificate of completion? What does it look like if they're in school till they're 22? And getting that getting an outside opinion too is really important. I think also often in these, especially edge cases around what trajectory is going to best, set my kid up for success.
Yeah, and that's a super important point, and getting started early, on that transition planning, heading into high school. And, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, mild intellectual disability doesn't mean you're not going to be able to acquire skills needed to function relatively independently as an adult. But you may need to get a jump start on working on some of those skills, right? To working on, functional literacy skills, functional math skills, money management, things like that, job skills and getting a jump start on that in high school and starting to develop those so by the time you're 22 years old, you have a lot of those skills to be gainfully employed and to live and function with greater independence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we covered a lot of ground as we kind of always do here, right? So again, I mean, this is a heavy topic. We're talking about intellectual disability. I don't want to take anything, away from how difficult this can be for parents, and sometimes certain labels we tend to try to avoid, right? They're hard to accept, but certainly having an accurate assessment, so that we do know what is going on with a young person, and we can plan appropriately. Education wise, transition wise, planning for their adult life, right, and setting them up for success, are all really important things. And you know we we don't want to look away from it. If this is something that our child, the types of supports and services that our child really does require, we want to make sure that they're able to access those things, and that all of that begins with an accurate assessment.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you, Danielle, as always, for your expertise on this topic. And I guess until next time, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Take
All right,
care.
take care. Bye.